Welcome to this session of International Business Environment. So, in this session, let us discuss regarding trade theories. And in our last session, we were discussing regarding the international trade, and we had a question regarding why does nations engage themselves in international trade. And along with that, we also had some of the questions like, what is it that people who live far away in different nation, those who speak different language and operate under different legal and economic system, why do they take the trouble of exchanging goods and services? Now the reason for this can be said in terms of three views. The first one is the economic view, and this view tells that now, whenever two nations or whenever any nation which goes into international business or this activity of exchanging goods, they do the business with the main aim because they would have found some economic gains for both the countries by doing these activities. Now, the economic gains can be anything in terms of exchange reserves or in terms of money, capital gains, or having some kind of raw materials. It could be anything. Now, the second view is based on a resource based view. Now, this view tells that nations trade because some firms in one nation generates exports that are valuable, unique, and hard to imitate. And when they do so, what happens is that the in economies of scale can be achieved, and also that there would be no any wastage of any kind of resource. And the third view is that institutional based view. Now it is on the view that there are different rules that govern trade, which determines how gains can be shared among the nations. Now, speaking of trade theory, trade theory starts with why different nations or countries trade and how do they meet the ends by discussing the benefits to countries engaged in such trade. Now, international trade theory helps in explaining the pattern of the trade as well as the distribution of gains arising from such trade. Now, it also helps in explaining the observed trade and also discusses the effects of trade on the domestic economy. And that is where all this trade theory provides an answer to question like, why do nations trade? Why why do they trade? Or is trade between two countries a good thing? Speaking of that, the first one is mercantilism. Now, speaking about mercantilism, in earlier days, if at all we have to date, we can date back to 16th to 18th century. This mercantilism was the economic philosophy that maintained that a country's wealth will be measured by its holdings of gold and silver. And probably it is this because of this philosophy that India had earned a lot of gold, and India was called as golden bird during the ancient times, even before 16th century. According to the principle of this mercantilism, a country's goal should be to enlarge its holdings. And when under mercantilism they speak of holdings, it is nothing but the assets in the form of gold and silver. And in order to increase the gold in the country, it was believed that money should come into the country and not go out of the country. Therefore, this mercantilism suggests that the ruling government should advance all those goals by playing a protectionist role in the economy, wherein it does the act of encouraging exports and discouraging imports. And if we note, during this mercantilism, through the use of subsidies and tariffs, every nation used to encourage export, and on the same time they used to discourage imports. Now, this theory of mercantilism dominated the Western European economic policies from almost 16th to late 18th century. Now, if we note, it was the time of colonialism, and the nations concentrated on capturing the colonies, by exploiting them to purchase the raw materials from the captured countries at a very cheap rate, and they also used these countries as a market to sell their finished goods at a very high price. Now, there was no move to sell goods between the nations. Now, considering the socio-economic conditions which used to prevail in those times, this mercantilism might have been a useful line of thought. But mercantilism has several shortcomings. Now, speaking about its major limitation, it is confused that the acquisition of treasure with the acquisition of wealth. Now, both are two different things, because assets in the modern times does not only exist in the form of gold and silver. There are newer and other forms of assets also, especially nowadays it is technology based assets. Moreover, this protectionist policy weakens the country because it robs or it limits the individual's ability to trade freely. And by trading freely, whatever benefits they used to get, even there has been restriction on that. Moreover, it also forces countries to produce product it would otherwise not, in order to minimize the inputs. That is to tell, now there are many goods produced by a country, but then when we compare with the other countries, sometimes there are chances that instead of buying, instead of producing, it would be cheap to buy from other countries. But according to the principle of mercantilism, it used to encourage export but discourage imports. And for discouraging export, it had to produce even those goods which probably it would not have produced in case there existed trade between two countries. Now, this theory of mercantilism was questioned by economists like Adam Smith, and later it was questioned by Ricardo. Now, according to them, by giving due importance to the individuals and stressing that their welfare was the welfare of the nation. Now, these economists, they believed in free trade and they always supported liberalism and enlightenment, and also that they treated the wealth of the nation in terms of what they call as the sum of enjoyments of the individuals in the society, and they did not merely consider it in terms of gold or silver. And therefore, according to the critics, any activity which would increase the consumption of the people was to be considered with favor. And accordingly, their trade theories uh, or the different trade theories proposed by these critics were based upon the principle of free trade and the specialization in the production of those goods where resources were most suitable. Now, this is the first theory, and this theory is considered as one of the traditional theory of international trade. Now, the next one is theory of absolute advantage. Now, this theory of absolute advantage was proposed by none other than Adam Smith himself. And Adam Smith argued that the mercantilism theory, it used to rob individuals of the ability to trade freely and to benefit from the voluntary exchanges. And according to this theory of absolute advantage, he tells that a country should export those goods and services for which it is more productive than other countries, and on the other hand, it should import those goods and services for which other countries are more productive than it is. Now, I shall tell it once again. According to the absolute advantage theory, whenever a country goes in for export, it should export those goods and services for which it will have more productivity than the other countries, and the country should be importing those goods or services for which other countries would be more productive than it is. Now, for that matter, a country is said to possess an absolute advantage over its trading partner when it can produce more of an output with a given amount of inputs. Now, this can be understood better with the help of an example. Now, suppose if at all we are, you know, analyzing or taking into consideration two countries. First one, England and Portugal. Now, both these countries, England and Portugal, both produces wine and also cloth. Uh, now, wait a second. Okay, now this had to be cloth. Not okay. Now both of the countries produce wine and cloth. Now, when there is no trade between two countries, take into consideration a hypothetical situation that both of the countries produces the goods as per their needs, and we should also assume that each country has 1,000 units of outputs or 1,000 units of inputs and uses the resources equally to produce the production. Okay, and when that is the case, England could produce 1 unit of wine and 12 units of cloth, and Portugal could produce 6 units of wine and 10 units of cloth by using 1,000 units of input. Okay, so now this used to be the output for 1,000 units of input, and if at all now we consider that a situation wherein which uh, we can take into consideration that both out of the 1,000 units that it has, it used to divide it among the two equally. That is to tell 500 units of input for wine and 500 units of input for cloth. So, when we consider this example, the output would be in total, England could have produced 500 units of wine and 6,000 units of cloth, and by using the 1,000 units input, dividing it equally, Portugal could have produced 3,000 units of wine and 5,000 units of cloth. Therefore, it resulted in the total output of the both the countries to be 3,500 units of wine and 11,000 units of cloth. Okay. Yes. Now, in this scenario, if we see properly, the total output is 3,500 and 11,000 units. Now, both the countries used to consume also what they produce. Now, this was the case when they did not used to exchange the goods. Whatever resources they had in terms of input and whatever the products they required in terms of output, they themselves used to produce, and it resulted in a hypothetical output of 3,500 units of wine and 11,000 units of cloths. By taking into consideration the same example, if we check what might have happened if these countries would have produced those goods in which they specialized, leaving out the less specialized to the other country. Okay, so in this scenario, we can assume that each country specializes in the production of that product for which it has an absolute advantage. So, if we take into consideration in this example, England had an absolute advantage in cloth, and Portugal had an absolute advantage over the production of wine. Now, that is where the absolute advantage theory tells that Portugal both should allocate their full resources to only one product in which they had absolute cost advantage. Now, that is to tell, we said that the input was 1000, and we also said that England should produce cloth and Portugal should produce wine. So now, instead of this dividing these inputs for both the countries, the absolute cost advantage tells that the entire inputs, and according to this example, 1000 units what both the countries has in its disposal should be used for those product which has on which it has absolute advantage. So now, according to this example, England had absolute cost advantage over cloth. So if all the inputs, 1000 inputs was used to produce cloth, then the output of cloth would be 12,000. And Portugal had absolute cost advantage over the production of wine, and if at all it produced if at all it produced wine by using all the 1000 inputs, then it could produce 6,000 units of wine. So the total production of both wine and cloth would be 6,000 and 12,000. So if we compare it with the earlier one, we can also note that whenever a country produces those goods over which it has absolute cost advantage, the production has increased by 2,500 units for wine. That is, it has increased from 3,500 to 6,000. And when it comes for total production of cloth, it has increased from 11,000 to 12,000. So now, if at all the disturbance from your side is not much, I shall continue. Otherwise, you can study this for your own. First of all, this is a bit confusing. I just hope that you all understand. Now, speaking about this absolute cost advantage, I would tell it once again. This speaks of a situation wherein a country should start producing those goods in which it has more advantage or favorable conditions in producing, and it should leave out the production of those goods to different countries over which the other countries would be having benefits. And to explain this it in an easy term, they have taken a situation. Now, under this situation, what happens is that there are two countries which are taken into consideration, England and Portugal, and they produce wine and cloth. And they, by using the thousand, whatever the inputs they have, they could produce 1 unit of wine for 12 unit of cloth, and Portugal could produce 6 unit of wine for 10 units of cloth. And we take into consideration a hypothetical situation wherein we tell that both the countries would have 1000 units of inputs for producing either wine or cloth. And in this example, we consider that they would divide the inputs that are available into the production of both wine and cloth equally. And in that case, uh, here in which there was trade was not between the two countries, England could produce 500 units of wine and 6000 units of cloth, and Portugal, by using 500 units of inputs, it could produce 3000 units of wine as output and 5000 units of cloth as output. And thereby, when we add the total output of both wine and cloth of both the countries, it used to be 3500 units of wine and 11,000 units of cloth. Now, this is a simple calculation where it is multiplied by inputs into the output per unit of input. So, 1 into 500 is 500, 12 into 500 is 6000. And the next situation is considered according to absolute theory. And according to this theory, what happens is that when the country produces that particular product over which it has absolute advantage, and by using the entire inputs on that particular product, whereas according to this example, when England produces cloth by using all the inputs on cloth, it could produce 12,000 units of cloth, and on the other hand, Portugal could produce 6,000 units of wine. So, thereby we can tell that when we compare the production of the countries during, zero trade between two countries, and during the trade among themselves, there is an increase in the total output. Okay. Hence, with the same output, it is said under this particular theory that the foreign trade benefit the two countries and increase the output. Now, after trade, the international exchange ratio also would lie somewhere between the pre-trade exchange ratio of two countries. That is to tell, the additional output produced because of the trade will be distributed according to the terms of trade between the two countries. Now, for this purpose, the domestic scenario of the two countries had always been studied. And according to this example, in England, 1 unit of wine is equal to 12 units of cloth. And other words, it is nothing but 1 unit of cloth is equal to 1 by 12 barrel of wine. Similarly, in case of Portugal, 1 unit of wine is equal to 2/3 unit of cloth, and 1 unit of cloth is equal to 3/5 unit of wine. Hence, the additional output will be taken by the two countries, and both would benefit from trade as compared to production in isolation. Now, moving forward, to understand this better, we can also tell that this absolute advantage theory simply implies that a country should import goods that are cheaper abroad. That is, when the cost of importing goods from other countries is less than the cost of producing it domestically, and export goods which it can produce more efficiently than other countries. Now, it can be this particular theory can be clear with one more example. Suppose, take into consideration there are two countries. Here we can take India and Bangladesh. Now both the countries are capable of producing two products, that is radio and fan. Now the underlying assumption is that both use just one factor of production, that is labor. Because it is example, we are considering that they are using only labor for production of radio and fan. Now both the countries are given with 10 labor hours each, and this 10 labor can be utilized to produce these two commodities. And here we can see that in the example, India has absolute advantage in producing radios, and Bangladesh has absolute advantage in producing fans. That is to tell, India can produce 30 units of radios and 20 units of fans with 10 labor hours available for each. On the other hand, Bangladesh can produce 10 units of radio and 50 units of fan for 10 labor hours that is available. So it is very clear from the example given here, which depicts the production possibility frontiers. Okay. Now, uh, now here trade from gain can happen when India is producing radio and Bangladesh starts producing fans with the available entire resource, because instead of dividing the 10 labor resources among these two kinds of products, if at all India produces only radio over which it has absolute cost advantage, and if Bangladesh goes for producing only fan over which it has absolute cost advantage, then it would result in the increase of total output. So here what has happened is, when instead of dividing the 10 hours 5 they have used the entire on the radio. So 30 into 2 would be 60 and 50 into 2 would be 100. Thereby the total production has increased from 40 to 60 and 70 to 100 units. So it is set under absolute cost advantage that India should produce radio and export it to Bangladesh and import fans from there. On the other hand, Bangladesh should produce fans and export to India and im- and import radio from there. Now, this trade leads to complete specialization where India is specialized in the production of radio and Bangladesh in the production of fans. Now, absolute advantage theory thus explains only presence of trade only when two countries have an absolute advantage respectively in two different commodities. Ordinarily, in the world, what happens is that at large, certain countries would have more efficient production. Therefore, they would be able to produce more with the given resources. And it seems anomalous that under such circumstances, such economies still do trade with other countries which are capable of producing. So, now speaking of absolute cost advantage theory, I hope it is clear. It is as simple to tell that when you take two countries and when you take two products, the country which can produce one product more efficiently compared to other, it should start exporting that, and the product which it cannot produce more efficiently compared to the other, it should start importing that. Along with that, it also considers what happens when trade between countries is not existing and what happens when trade between two countries exists. And this is a hypothetical theory because in practice a country goes with exchange of goods with many countries and different products, and also there are chances that it imports the same products from different countries. So it becomes your work that you do a search on what are the advantages of absolute theory and what are the criticisms that it has for this idea of absolute advantage. So, for this class, we shall wind it up here. Speaking of which, it reminds me that this is the second among the traditional trade theory we have. Tomorrow, we shall discuss the comparative cost advantage. So, I have taken your attendance. You can leave the meeting for the day.